Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome back to this Tuesday session of Walter Rodney's "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa." It's good to finally be back reading with y'all. Today, I won't be presiding over the session, but our comrade Lecton will be starting chapter 3 of "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa." And as always, we'll get it out to YouTube for y'all as soon as possible, so those who can't be with us live can still check it out later and follow along. So without further ado, let me pass it off to Lecton.
Hello. Um, yeah, again, good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. It's good that we get to come back to all this, and I guess we'll just kind of get right into it. If anyone is interested in reading, you can just put in chat in the Walter Rodney reading chat that you are interested in reading. I'll read for a little bit, then we can have a bit of a session and we can kind of go back and forth. All right. Does everyone have the PDF up? Do you want me to stream my screen? How are you feeling about that aspect? Yeah, I'll just ask that first. Saber, can you stream your screen actually? Can you stream your Walter Rodney reading so that everyone can follow along as I go ahead and read? But yeah, I will start with chapter 3, just as we said, and we'll go on from there. All right. Chapter 3: Africa's contribution to European capitalist development, the pre-colonial period. British trade is a management superstructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. Malachi Postlethwaite. The African trade, the great pillar and support of the British plantation. The African trade, the great pillar and support of the British plantation trade in North America, 1745. If you were to lose each year more than 200 million le- levers that you now get from your colonies, if you would not if you had not the exclusive trade with your colonies to feed your manufacturers, to maintain your navy, to keep your agriculture going, to repay for your imports, to provide for your luxury needs, to advantageously balance your trade with Europe and Asia, then I say it clearly, the kingdom would be irretrievably lost. Bishop Murray of France. Argument against France's ending the slave trade and giving freedom to its slave colonies, presented in the French National Assembly, 1791. 3.1: How Europe became the dominant section of a worldwide trade system. Because of the superficiality of many of the approaches to underdevelopment, and because of resulting misconceptions, it is necessary to re emphasize that development and underdevelopment are not only comparative terms, but that they also have a dialectical relationship to one another. That is to say, the two help produce each other by interaction. Western Europe and Africa had a relationship which ensured the transfer of wealth from Africa to Europe. The transfer was possible only after trade became truly international. And that takes one back to the late 15th century when Africa and Europe were drawn into common relations for the first time, along with Asia and the Americas. The developed and underdeveloped parts of the present capitalist section of the world have been in continuous contact for 4.5 centuries. The contention here is that over that period, Africa helped to develop Western Europe in the same proportion as Western Europe helped to underdevelop Africa. The first significant thing about the internationalization of trade in the 15th century was that Europeans took the initiative and went to other parts of the world. No Chinese boats reached Europe, and if any African canoes reached the Americas, as is sometimes maintained, they did not establish two-way links. What was called international trade was nothing but the extension of overseas European interests. The strategy behind international trade and the production that supported it was firmly in European hands, specifically in the hands of the seagoing nations of the North Sea to the Mediterranean. They owned and directed the great majority of the world's seagoing vessels, and they controlled the financing of the trade between four continents. Africans, a little clue as to the tricontinental links between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Europe had a monopoly of knowledge about the international exchange system seen as a whole, for Western Europe was the only sector capable of viewing the system as a whole. Europeans used the superiority of their ships and cannon to gain control of all the world's waterways, starting with the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of North Africa. From 1415, when the Portuguese captured Ceuta under Gibraltar, they maintained the offensive against the Maghreb. Within the next 60 years, they seized ports such as Arzila, El Cassar, Es-Sagir, and Tangier, and fortified them. By the second half of the 15th century, the Portuguese controlled the Atlantic coast of Morocco and used its economic, strategic advantages to prepare for further navigations, which eventually carried their ships round the Cape of Good Hope in 1495. After reaching the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese sought with some success to replace Arabs as the merchants who tied East Africa to India and the rest of Asia. The 17th and 18th centuries, the Portuguese carried most of the East African ivory, which was marketed in India, while Indian cloth and beads were sold in East and West Africa by the Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French. The same applied to cowrie shells from the East Indies. Therefore, by control of the seas, Europe took the first step towards transforming the several parts of Africa and Asia into economic satellites. When the Portuguese and the Spanish were still in command of a major sector of world trade in the first half of the 17th century, they engaged in buying cotton cloth in India to exchange for slaves in Africa to mine gold in Central and South America. Part of the gold in the Americas would then be used to purchase spices and silks from the Far East. The concept of metropole and dependency automatically came into existence when parts of Africa were caught up in the web of international commerce. On the one hand, there were the European countries who decided on the role to be played by the African economy, and on the other hand, Africa formed an extension to the European capitalist market. As far as foreign trade was concerned, Africa was dependent on what Europeans were prepared to buy and sell. Europe exported to Africa goods which were already being produced and used in Europe itself: Dutch linen, Spanish iron, English pewter, Portuguese wines, French brandy, Venetian glass beads, German muskets, etc. Europeans, which Europeans were also able to unload on the African continent goods which had become unsaleable in Europe. Thus, items like old sheets, cast off uniforms, technologically outdated firearms, and lots of odds and ends found guaranteed markets in Africa. Africans slowly became aware of the possibility of demanding and obtaining better imported goods, and pressure was exerted on the captains of European ships. But the overall range of trade goods which left the European ports of Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Liverpool was determined almost exclusively by the pattern of production and consumption within Europe. From the beginning, Europe assumed the power to make decisions within the international trading system. An excellent illustration of that is the fact that the so called international law, which governed the conduct of nations on the high seas, was nothing else but European law. Africans did not participate in its making, and in many instances, African people were simply the victims, for the law recognized them as a transportable merchandise. If the African slave was thrown overboard at sea, the only legal problem that arose was whether or not the slave ship could claim compensation from the issuers. Above all, from the insurers, sorry, from the insurers. Above all, European decision-making power was exercised in selecting what Africa should export in accordance with European needs. The ships of the Portuguese gave the search for gold the highest priority, partially partly on the base of well-known information that West African gold reached Europe across the Sahara, and partly on the basis of guesswork. The Portuguese were successful in obtaining gold in parts of West Africa and in Central Africa, and it was the Gold Coast which attracted the greatest attention from Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries. The number of ports, sorry, I scrolled at the wrong time. The number of forts built there was proof to that effect, and the nations involved included the Scandinavians and the Prussians or Germans, apart from their colonial from other colonial stalwarts like the British, Dutch, and Portuguese. All right. Do you want to take a break here and just kind of have a bit of discussion? I feel like I've read a little bit. I have a couple highlights, and I think there's some things we can talk about. If anyone wants to uh say anything, just type stack in chat. I can call on you, and you can sort of bring your thoughts to the front. Some things that kind of stuck out to me was how in the very start it was talking about the that quote from the Bishop of Mari of France. That's on page 115 in the PDF, where it's talking about how they can't end the slave trade, or they can't end their colonies, because if they do, they wouldn't be able to maintain the sort of control that they have right now. Like their entire kingdom would be irretrievably lost, right? And we can see that that was true and still holds true to this day if we kind of look at the neocolonial situation that France has in Africa, over 14 African nations where they are able to control like their economic power. They print their money. If you look up the CFA franc, you'll find it. They constantly extract a lot of resources out of the nations, and of course there isn't much of a back and forth. The primary companies that run in all of these nations are French companies, Orange, Total. I'm kind of blanking on other names right now, but they're all French companies as well. So the companies that run are all French. The monetary system is controlled by France. You have to have a minimum amount of French soldiers within their borders at any given point in time. So there are thousands of French soldiers throughout the continent right now, both in West and Central Africa. So like we can see that the neocolonial situation in Africa is such that a lot of this still hasn't changed, and a lot of what's propped up this France even to this day, a lot of the sort of social programs that they have is this exploitation of Africa. All right, let's get to chat. So Sensi Doofus said that quote is a great example of colonizers saying out loud what we knew. Exactly. Saber's asking for a link, and he got the link. All right, but yeah, 100%. I agree with Sensi. It's just it's 100% the case. All right. Saber said sack. All right, you can talk.
Yeah. So one sentence that kind of stuck out to me is near the beginning of the chapter where it says, the contention here is that over that period, Africa helped to develop Western Europe in the same proportion as Western Europe helped to underdevelop Africa. And I feel
Mhm.
like that's a interesting way of phrasing it. This is why, like, I don't necessarily see a big uh, contradiction to where people say Africa is not underdeveloped, it's overexploited. Parenti quote. I don't know if
Mhm.
he coined that, or whatever, but I feel like it's essentially just the same way of saying, um, or two different ways of saying the same thing essentially. And I feel like that wording kind of just drives home, especially when you realize that like the development of Europe, it's almost as though it's like an active process of underdevelopment, um, due to the development of Europe, and so it kind of just, in my head, when I kind of visualize it in my head, it kind of makes more sense when you kind of see just how intertwined the process really was. But yeah, something that kind of stuck out to me.
Yeah, 100%. Like that relationship, that fundamental relationship to development and underdevelopment. Like I mean, them being integrally linked. And I guess when I when I also read when we're reading further, and it's talking about how much control Europe itself had over the global economic system, and when we kind of again draw parallels to what it is today, where you know you can't really do trade without the US having some some form of control over what you have, because of just how massive their reach is across the entire world. For example, Venezuela and Iran are trying to send oil back and forth to each other, and the U.S. steals a ship and sells off their oil, right? So it's like we kind of recognize that we live in this through what is described here. Realize what was created through Europe's control over the global economy is this kind of idea that there needs to be someone that maintains the global order, quote unquote, if you kind of think about it that way. And this is the context in which every other thing in society exists in, right? So yeah, so they're talking about how Europe was trying to ensure that they had the direct line to each and every situation so that they could essentially mark things up, be the middleman, and kind of give, they could be the ones to control the trade. But yeah, I 100% see exactly what you're talking about, Saber. Let me read this what Sensi said. Blows my mind to think about how I, and I assume all Americans and probably all Europeans, was raised to just know, quote, "Oh, Europe is rich and Africa is poor, and that's just how it is," end quote, with no connection between that. Yeah, 100%. And as a Jamaican, like that's how we're all taught essentially, right? Because remember, all of the propaganda that you get is spread out throughout the rest of the world as well, right? Hollywood is international. It's definitely not just a local thing. And so all of the lies and propaganda that you get, all of us get it too. So we're all being fed very similar white supremacist lies. So it definitely takes a lot of work and a lot of education to ensure that we kind of unlearn all this bullshit. Just like think about it. Just the other day, I don't remember which country it was, found like one of the which African nation it was, found one of the world's purest diamonds, and they couldn't decide whether the nation should sell it or the company behind it should sell it. And we know for a fact that the person that found that diamond isn't gonna get shit. So it was just very interesting to kind of watch all of those machinations happen in real time. Um, yeah, and I talked to quite a few people on the continent, on the African continent itself, and they suffer the same kind of miseducation as well from their own neocolonial stooge leaders. So it's definitely like 100% an international thing, that kind of miseducation. Um, people laughing because of what just happened, and then Senti again says the relationship between underdevelopment and development means using dialectical materialism, which is a no-no for colonizers and capitalists. Exactly. I mean, thinking in that way would lead to communism, if you get what I mean. Like you just like it. How do I? No, I don't know how to describe it. Things need to be disconnected from each other so that you can kind of lay blame to the people who are being overexploited, right? That the underdevelopment is happening to. Otherwise, they would seek to gain more control over their resources. But when they do that, because it's not like it didn't happen, they assassinate them, right? And then you try to ensure that you blame the internal forces. Something that comes to mind is Thomas Sankara, where he effectively got out of colonial rule from France. At the time the nation was named Upper Volta. It's now called Burkina Faso. Um, and within 4 years, he was able to increase the literacy rate, grow like over 1 million trees or some shit like that. He advocated for women's rights and many other things as well. And France, throughout the entire time, what they did was to get into the mind of one of his friends. I'm kind of blanking on his name right now. And that person ended up killing Sankara. So oftentimes you hear the story of, oh, well, Sankara's friend killed Sankara. But behind it the whole time was France actively figuring out ways to undermine what was going on in Burkina Faso, constantly trying to figure out ways to destabilize and attack Burkina Faso from various different ways. So when we kind of hyper focus on that one element, it kind of creates this confusion. Uh and this is a very intentional thing as well. So like, that kind of liberal idea of kind of separating everything outside of their context is very critical to like maintaining the system as it is today. And that's why dialectical materialism and a dialectical analysis is um so important. And Saber is kind of giving me info. Blaise Compaoré, he was the one who went on to be president. Yeah, he was the friend that overthrew, or that was behind the coup against why am I blanking on his name? I just said it. I just said his name and I completely forget. But yeah. Then uh Saber agreeing with Sensi's take just now. And then Sensi says, shout out to Paulo Freire, 100%. I need to actually finish that book at some point. Saber said, I remember learning about this as I read this book for the first time and I literally couldn't unsee it. Yep. Then Zoe says, poverty is an individual choice and people should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Exactly. And if you just learned to code, you would you would be able to, you'd live well. Learn to code, clean your room, and the entire world will be fine. All right. Oh yeah, skip the avocado toast. Thank you so much, Zoe. I appreciate that. All right. Let's see. Okay, so we talked about that already. Yeah. I think I already spoke about the international trade. Mm, Oh, I didn't highlight enough. I'm sorry. Oh no. Does anyone have any highlights that they had? I do have something later on in the thing, but I just want to ensure that we kind of cover as much as we can. Um, okay. Yeah, this was an interesting part for me. By the second half of the 15th century, the Portuguese controlled the Atlantic coast of Morocco and used its economic and strategic advantages to prepare for further navigations, which eventually carried their ships round the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. After reaching the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese sought with some success to replace Arabs as the merchants who tied East Africa to India and the rest of Asia. In 17th and 18th centuries, the Portuguese carried most of the East African ivory, which was marketed in India, while India cloth and beads were sold in East and West Africa by the Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French. Saber, we're on page 117 in the PDF. The same applied to cowrie shells from the East Indies. Therefore, by control of the seas, Europe took the first steps towards transforming the several parts of Africa and Asia into economic satellites. And so you kind of see where what Europe did through the development of what Europe did through the development of the system was to intentionally put themselves at sort of the pathways between each and every person. No one likes a middleman, and that's exactly what Europe became, because that's that was the best way for them to make their profit, for them to control the trade routes, because all they really had were boats and cannons. That was the main thing that they had, and they kind of just stole everything from everyone else. And so that was the main thing. I think that was the main thing. Another thing that I highlighted as well was that from the beginning, Europe assumed the power to make decisions within the international trading system. An excellent illustration of that is the fact that the so-called international law, which governed the conduct of nations on the high seas, was nothing else but European law. Africans did not participate in its making, and many instances of African people and in many instances, African people were simply the victims, for the law recognized them only as transportable merchandise. If the African slave was thrown overboard at sea, the only legal problem that arose was whether or not the slave ship could claim compensation for the insurers. Above all, European decision-making power was exercised in selecting what Africa should export in accordance with European needs. And so from reading that, we can kind of also see where the control that Europe had, and sort of the way that they kind of project this idea of international law and stuff like that, and the way that we see even the way that the US, especially when they're challenging China, for example, and they're like, oh well, we need to maintain international law, blah blah blah, but all these laws are made by the imperialists. Like, all of the laws are made by the imperialist hegemony. And so when they say, oh well, we need to maintain this order, it's a Eurocentric order. It's a Western order. It's certainly not one that is intended to benefit all people, and we can see that through the ways in which the vast majority of the vast majority of the world is suffering, including people within their own nations, right? Like, how many people are currently houseless in America versus how many houses exist in America, right? That's what it's like. Like, you have houses for each person that's houseless. Is that, if I'm remembering that correctly, something around those lines? So, when they talk about international law, they definitely aren't talking about all people. Saber, you have a stack. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, like, based on just what you read, in terms of like the biggest issue with the biggest issue being like lost property and whatnot. Do you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
yeah, it's like that alone should just show people just how like morally bankrupt that entire like endeavor is, and like because obviously we know that set the foundation for the system that we have right now, but it's like that just the idea that like they're on this great mission, or what the ideas that they purport to say that, oh well, they're on this great mission to civilize people and stuff like that. It's like, how on earth do you even get to a point where like you dehumanize people to that point? It's just like
Mhm.
it's wild. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and it's either like when people uphold something like that, or system, or uphold or even defend it to this day, it's like it goes to show you just how little or I don't know, it just goes to show that even though it may not be as overt as it was, the mindset is still kind of there.
100%. The conditioning is still there. The propaganda is still there for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And just general like Afrophobia, and the way that it kind of permeates like white supremacy as a whole is something that is worth understanding as well. And it's certainly as a result of all of this that we're describing, right? All right. Sensi says, oh no. Okay, so if you remember, don't you can still say stack later on and we'll take you back in. But since he says stats on homeless people are really fluky because it's hard to collect data and it's at least 3-to-1 houses to people. At least. So people like in the US, no one has to be houseless right now. Literally no one has to be houseless. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could definitely develop a housing program. And that's what you're considering houses as well. Why can't we necessarily house people in essentially any structure that is safe, that's deemed to be safe enough? And once we kind of recognize that, like, all the malls that are being abandoned and stuff like that, like, we can potentially house far more people than even that. So there's more to that situation than I feel is oftentimes talked about. Also things to think about with your revolutionary organizing. Just saying. Um all right. Uh okay. I think I can just keep reading. And right, let me read what Zoe says. The issue is zoning laws which exist to protect no one except developers. Yep. Sadhu says houses aren't for living, they're for buying and selling and profiting off of, apparently. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I'm twirling my mustache right now. Exactly. That's the way. That's the capitalist way. I don't think there's anything better than this. Sorry. Okay. All right. All right. Let's I'll get back to the reading and y'all can keep talking in chat and we can go back and forth. All right. Also, if anyone wants to read, don't be afraid to speak up. I'm fine to let it off to anyone else, but I can also keep reading for a little bit, for a while as well. Okay. Okay. All right. Obviously, if Europe could tell Africans what to exploit, that was an expression of European power. However, it would be a mistake to believe that it was an overwhelming military power. Europeans found it impossible to conquer Africans during the early centuries of trade, except in isolated spots on the coast. European power resided in their system of production, which was at a somewhat higher level than Africa's at the time. European society was leaving feudalism and was moving towards capitalism. African society was entering a phase comparable to feudalism. The fact that Europe was the first part of the world to move from feudalism towards capitalism gave Europeans a head start over humanity elsewhere in the scientific understanding of the universe, the making of tools, and the efficient organization of labor. European technical superiority did not apply to all aspects of production, but the advantage which they possessed in a few key areas proved decisive. For example, African canoes on the River Nile and the Senegal coast were of a high standard, but the relevant sphere of operations was the ocean, where European ships could take command. West Africans had developed metal casting to a fine artistic perfection in many parts of Nigeria. But when it came to the meeting with European beautiful bronzes, wait, wait. West Africans had developed metal casting to a fine artistic perfection in many parts of Nigeria. But when it came to the meeting with Europe's beautiful bronzes were far less relevant than the crudest cannon. African wooden utensils were sometimes works of great beauty, but Europe produced pots and pans that had many practical advantages. Literacy and organizational experience, and the capacity to produce on an over-expanding scale also counted in the European favor. European manufacturers in the early years of trade with Africa were often of poor quality, but they were of new varieties and were found attractive. Esteban Montejo, an African who ran away from a Cuban slave plantation in the 19th century, recalled that his people were enticed into slavery by the color red. He said, "The scarlet of which the scarlet which did for the Africans, so- it was the scarlet which did for the Africans. Both kings and the rest surrendered without both kings and the rest struggle surrendered without a struggle. When the kings saw that the whites were taking out these scarlet handkerchiefs as if they were waving, they told the blacks, 'Go on then, go and get a scarlet handkerchief.' And the blacks were so excited by the scarlet, they ran down to the ships like sheep, and there they were captured." That version by one of the victims of slavery is very poetic. What it means is that some African rulers found European goods sufficiently desirable to hand over captives which they had taken in warfare. Soon, war began to be fought between one community and another for the sole purpose of getting prisoners for sale to Europeans. And even inside a given community, a ruler might be tempted to exploit his own subjects and capture them for sale. A chain reaction was started by European demand for slaves, and only slaves, and by their offer of consumer goods, this process being connected with divisions within African society. It is often said for the colonial project that vertical political divisions in Africa made conquest easy. This is even more true of the way that Africa succumbed to the slave trade. National unification was a product of mature feudalism and capitalism. Inside of Europe, there was far fewer political divisions than in Africa, where communalism meant political fragmentation with the family as the nucleus, and there were only a few states that had real territorial solidarity. Furthermore, when one European nation challenged another to obtain captives from an African ruler, Europe benefited from whichever of the two nations won the conflict. Any European trader could arrive on the coast of West Africa and exploit the political differences which he found there. For example, in a small territory that the Portuguese later claimed as Guinea-Bissau, there were more than a dozen ethnic groups. It was so easy to set one off against another that Europeans called it a slave trader's paradise. Although class divisions were not pronounced in African society, they too contributed to the case with which Europe imposed itself commercially on large parts of the African continent. The rulers had a certain status and authority, and when bamboozled by European goods, they began to use that position to raid outside their societies, as well as to exploit internally by victimizing some of their own subjects. In the simplest of societies, where there were no kings, it proved impossible for Europeans to strike up the alliance which was necessary to carry on a trade in captives on the coast. In those societies with ruling groups, the association with Europeans was easily established, and afterwards, Europe hardened the existing internal class divisions and created new ones. In effect, particular aspects of African society became weaknesses when Europeans arrived as representatives of a different phase of development. And yet, the subjugation of the African economy through slave trade was a slow process at the outset, and in some instances, African opposition or disinterest had to be overcome. In the Congo, the slave trade did not get underway without grave doubts and opposition from the king of the state of Congo at the beginning of the 16th century. He asked for masons, priests, clerks, physicians, etc., but instead he was overwhelmed by slave ships sent from Portugal, and a vicious trade was opened up by playing off one part of the Congo kingdom against another. The king of the Congo had conceived of possibilities of mutually beneficial interchange between his people and the European state, but the latter forced him to specialize in the export of human cargo. It is also interesting to note that while the Oba, or king of Benin, was willing to sell a few female captives, it took a great deal of persuasion and pressure from Europeans to get him to sell male African prisoners of war who would otherwise have been brought to the ranks of Benin society. Okay, let me read this, and then I think we can go back to discussion. Once trade in slaves had been started in any given part of Africa, it soon became clear that it was beyond the capacity of any single African state to change the situation. In Angola, the Portuguese employed an unusual number of their own troops and tried to seize political power from Africans. The Angolan state of Matamba on the river Kwango was founded around 1630 as a direct reaction against the Portuguese. With Queen Nzinga at its head, Matamba tried to coordinate resistance against the Portuguese in Angola. However, Portugal gained the upper hand in 1648, and this left Matamba isolated. Matamba could not forever stand aside. So long as it opposed trade with the Portuguese, it was an object of hostility from neighboring African states, which had been compromised with Europeans and slave trading. So in 1656, Queen Nzinga resumed business with the Portuguese, a major concession to the decision-making role of Europeans within the Angolan economy. Oh, okay, wait, let me read this since it's another example. Another example of African resistance during the course of the slave trade comes from the Baga people in what is now the Republic of Guinea. The Baga lived in small states, and about 1,720. Wait, one of their leaders, Tamba by name, aimed. Oh, that was 1720. One of their leaders, Tamba by name, aimed at securing an alliance to stop the slave traffic. He was defeated by local European resident traders, mulattoes, and other slave trading Africans. It is not difficult to understand why Europeans should have taken immediate steps to see that Tamba and his Baga followers did not opt out of the role allocated to them by Europe. A parallel which presents itself is the manner in which Europeans got together to wage the Opium War against China in the 19th century to ensure that Western capitalists would make profit while the Chinese were turned into dope addicts. Back to discussion. All right. Again, if anyone wants to speak, you can just type stack in chat. I'll go through a couple of my highlights and try to kind of lead a discussion that way. All right. And oh, here we go. Okay. All right. So the first one that I have right now is since gold was limited to very small areas of Africa, as far as Europeans were aware, the principal export was human beings. Only in a very few places at the given times was the export of another commodity of equal or greater importance. For instance, in the Senegal, there was gum, in Sierra Leone, camwood, and in Mozambique, ivory. However, even after taking those things into account, one can say that Europe allocated to Africa the role of supplier of human captives to be used as slaves in various parts of the world. And that's, I don't know, just reading that is kind of chilling to me, right? Because at the end of the day, it just kind of says that um it Europe didn't even see Africa as anything but just a toiling mass, right? You're just okay. How can we? What's the most efficient way we can exploit these people? Okay, we can force them to be workers and let them work for us for free, right? And we're talking about a situation where they're moving from feudalism to capitalism. So this is kind of the idea. So how do I say the basis upon which like a lot of capitalist development was occurring and has been occurring, right? And I mean, it kind of makes sense. Again, as you might have realized, I try to relate things to where they are today because really and truly, this system is the same system. but this is why you have such a high prison population in the US, and many of them are forced to do labor. For example, at the start of COVID in New York, there were prisoners that were forced to make hand sanitizer. Whenever there are fires in California, they send prisoners to do their fire for them. I believe that prisoners are also made to make what's it called? License plates for cars and everything. So there's a lot of different things that they're used to do. I think I remember there was during the Democratic the what's it called? The Democratic primaries. I think I remember something along the lines of prisoners being used for, was it call center? Like as like a call center, and like they were being paid by Michael Bloomberg by Michael Bloomberg's campaign to do calls and everything. Of course they're paid like pennies on the dollar. And it was actually the prison itself that was earning the money off of all of this. So we can see that like this kind of exploitation still exists in modern society, quote unquote modern society. It just changed in the way that it exists, right? The very same people in the past that were fighting for the abolition of enslavement, we can see are actually the same groups and the same peoples that are fighting for the abolishment and the removal of like the prison industrial complex and stuff like that, because it's all related. One kind of related to the next, to the next, to the next. The 13th Amendment didn't abolish slavery. It just switched the context and said, oh well, you can only enslave people under these contexts. And so they just made the contexts exist so that they could enslave people whenever they wanted to. Think the war on drugs, for example. Sensi says, so as the West moved away from feudalism, they just replaced the labor with foreign slaves. And when the US abolished slavery, they just arrested a bunch more people and used their labor to replace slave labor. Exactly. 100%. Then Sadhu says, America has 25% of the world's prison population and half are black. That means 12% of the world's prisoners are black Americans. Yeah. Yep. hmm I saw a quote, but I don't I haven't verified it, so maybe I should repeat it. But yeah, there is a lot of enslavement that still exists to this day. If we want to talk about enslavement being an individual who's, I don't know if I want to use these terms, but I'll just use it. An individual whose economic activity is owned by someone else. They don't produce anything for themselves in any sort of real material way, but it's being appropriated entirely by someone else. Slavery still exists in the United States of America, if we want to define it that way. No, it wasn't a former Nixon aide quote. It was a statistic actually, I meant to say. The statistic was something along the lines of there are more enslaved there are more imprisoned black Americans than there are Africans on the African continent. But I didn't verify if that was the case. I didn't look at enough things. All right. The quote from Sadhu said, you might be thinking of this one. Quote, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. End quote. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I'm just gonna say free my niggas. Like but yeah, at the end of the day, it is a situation that the war on drugs to was entirely manufactured to ensure to deal with like the anti-war movement that was developing at the time. And yeah, was and still is, and was intentionally designed in such a way that they could target certain communities. Because remember, like a lot of the drugs that were being pushed into black communities were a part of, you know, the CIA led drug trade across the world anyways, right? So it's like you're going to introduce the drugs, but then you're also going to target these people for having drugs, right? It's like all of this is very much, all of it is intentionally manufactured from the bottom up by the state to ensure that, by the bourgeois state, to ensure that this situation can exist. And yeah, yeah. I think that kind of covers my thoughts on that. And since it clarifies, was and still is. Yep. Okay. Let me see. My next quote says, Europeans found it impossible to conquer Africans during the early centuries of trade, except in isolated spots on the coast. European power resided in their system of production, which was at a somewhat higher level than Africa's at the time. European society was leaving feudalism and was moving towards capitalism. African society was then entering a phase comparable to feudalism. Then Saidu says, clear example is the difference in prison sentences between crack and powder cocaine. Essentially the same substance, but a different method of delivery. Yep. Yeah, essentially the same substance in terms of in terms of how it interacts with your body. But of course, one was more expensive and was of course more among whiter populations, and then the other was quite a bit cheaper as far as I understand it. I don't know anything about the prices of any drugs. I've never taken any drugs in my life. So yeah, the the entire purpose was to ensure that like you could target these particular communities in certain types of ways. Plant the drugs in them, whatever, like it doesn't matter. Just ensure that you can break up these communities, ensure that they cannot really exist in any meaningful way amongst each other, so that they can't challenge this white supremacist system above them. Yeah, and so the part that I just read about like European society moving from feudalism to capitalism, African society moving from entering a phase comparable to feudalism. I think another thing that Walter Rodney does in this book is kind of contextualize what this kind of feudalism was looking like. Wherein it was definitely a lot more family centered. It was definitely a lot more focused on a community idea, whereas we can see that the kind of feudalism that we saw in Europe was a bit sharper in terms of its class divide and the structure that existed as well. So I guess you can kind of see that there are quite a few differences in the structure of these systems, and may have been why Europe was able to so quickly move from feudalism to capitalism, whereas African society was taking a bit longer to kind of get to these quote unquote stages of development. As Saber said, yeah, seem to be more communal. Yep, 100%. My next quote goes to Saber asks, have you got any ideas on why they develop differently? So um essentially through conversations with people who know way more history than me, what I've gathered is what they described as supremacy ideologies developing. And the way that they put it is that within you could say that at various times within various societies, supremacy ideologies sort of existed, right? It kind of came and it went. It came and it went depending on certain societies. But of course, it's these supremacy ideologies that allow for some people to feel justified to be above another set of people, right? And of course, this kind of fundamentally messes with any sort of idea of a communal structure. So largely what at least my friend, again, this isn't necessarily my analysis, this is just someone else's analysis that I'm trying to purvey. Essentially what was occurring in African society was that we didn't necessarily maintain as much of that those supremacy ideologies in the same way that Europe did. And the same way, and the reason why Europe kind of maintained those supremacy ideologies had everything to do with racism. They were very scared about the Ottoman Empire coming over and taking over the entirety of Europe, and it was things like that. Orientalism was kind of the basis upon which a lot of these supremacy ideologies maintained themselves throughout European development. Yeah, and so that was largely why capitalism, or largely why the European mentality maintained itself in the way that it did, through kind of having this idea that, okay, well, these people are the hordes of, I can't think of a word that I don't want to say but feel fitting right now. But yeah, these hordes of undesirables are coming to take us over. So we need to do something about it, and this in many ways kind of influence the ways in which European thought developed. And so they kind of, that's a part of why they developed sharper societal structure. And there's a lot of other things to do with like colonization and the destruction of many of the I guess you could say quote unquote proto-European cultures that had existed. But I don't know enough about that to talk even more specifically about that one right now. So those are some of the elements as to why they ended up developing a bit differently. So that was a bit of a response to what Sensi said, saying they'd like to hear more about that at some point. Saber says, I think the environment may also have to do with it, in the sense that Europe may be more scarce, whereas Africa is more abundant. And that may have shaped the kinds of societies that arose. 100%. But what I was talking about before with regard to the colonization, what also occurred was just like, if I remember correctly, just mass destruction of a lot of what was there before. And a lot of the what was potentially agricultural land was replaced with just grass, and we have no idea why you'd replace agricultural land with grass. So some of that scarcity was almost conditioned, if that makes sense. It was almost like forced, if you understand what I'm saying. So there's a lot of it. There's a lot of history that we can't know because of how much of it was destroyed throughout. I can't remember the exact period, but there's a lot of information that was destroyed. There's a lot that can't be gotten back, especially right now with white supremacy existing in the way that it has, where this new quote unquote pan-European identity has developed and existed as this white supremacist construct. It's difficult to truly parse what the facts and what the myths are with regard to these societies and the way that they existed before. So that's kind of another problem that we face when we're talking about a lot of this. Then Sensi says, with technological advancement in different areas, I have always assumed technology advances slower in areas if not necessary. If you have no need for tech in a specific area, why would your society develop it? Essentially, yeah, that is 100% the case. That's like very materialist as well. It's like, why do I need a boat if I live in the mountains? Okay, well, I guess there has to be rivers because I need water. It's in some way, but you get what I mean. Like you kind of develop the technology to deal with your material situation. So yeah, 100%. That is, yeah, I agree with that. Um, you can keep talking. I'll just go on to the next quote, the next part that I highlighted, where it says European manufacturers in the early years of the trade with Africa were often of poor quality, but they were of new varieties and were found attractive. Esteban Montejo, an African who ran away from a Cuban slave plantation in the 19th century, recalled that his people were enticed into slavery by the color red. He said it was the scarlet which did for the Africans. Both kings and the rest surrendered without a struggle. When the king saw that the whites were taking out these scarlet handkerchiefs as if they were waving, they told the blacks, "Go on then, go and get a scarlet handkerchief." And the blacks were so excited by the scarlet they ran down to the ships like sheep, and there they were captured. And so it's important to kind of contextualize what this was. Remember, from the context of the Africans in that sense, they were not seeing what was going to come. They saw beautiful things. They saw very shiny products. They saw all of these goods and such, and they were saying, "Oh, well, if you come here with us, we're gonna give you all of this. Like this will be great." And so they went. It's just, of course, that's not the plan. Like the Europeans never planned on giving them anything. The entire plan was just bait. It was just bait, um, baiting them to enslavement. Um, and if that was Cuban, that means it was Spanish. That was also interesting. Saber says that relates to earlier in the book where he talks about the use of animals in favor of vehicles depending on the situation, navigating through forests or deserts, etc. Exactly. Then he talks about distribution. They're not, yeah. Class divisions were not pronounced in African society. They too contributed to the case with which Europe imposed itself commercially on large parts of the African continent. Sorry, not produce. I didn't mean produce. I meant pronounced. We're not as pronounced. Yeah, I don't really have much else to say other than this was another element. Let me see. The next part that I have highlighted: the king of the Congo had conceived of possibilities of mutually beneficial interchange between his people and the European state, but the latter forced him to specialize in the export of human cargo. It is also interesting to note that while the Oba, which is king of Benin, was willing to sell a few female captives, it took a great deal of persuasion and pressure from Europeans to get him to sell male African prisoners of war who would otherwise have been brought into the ranks of Benin society. And so we kind of see that there's a situation where, like, because generally speaking, why am I blanking on it? Walter Rodney's talking about how, you know, the kings were kind of used to sell their own, was kind of used, the kings would come into deals with the Europeans, and these kings would then sell their enslaved would sell some of their captives to um European traders. Another thing to remember about all of this, again, when we're talking about it contextually, is that, you know, chattel slavery in the West was like nothing, you know, was like nothing that had ever happened before. And so there isn't really a context for how bad it would have been when these captives would have been sold off, right? There was no idea that, oh well, it would, like, there was just this really high mortality. They're going to go on a ship where they'd be packed on like sardines. They would be separated intentionally from all of their families and relationships. They would be mistreated, whipped, you know, just, and they would never get really any sort of freedom for literally hundreds of years. you know, so that's, there's that element of context that was not really given, or that you just wouldn't have been able to be had when you're just like the king of an empire that's just trying to survive. Uh, and you see all these interesting goods being brought to your door. You're like, okay, well, I mean, we have the people that you want, and you have a thing that we want. Sometimes they ask for more, and the Europeans were like, fuck you. And as we go further on in the book, we recognize, oh, actually, there are a couple African states that decided to try to push back against it. It's just that they were too isolated in the way that they pushed back against it. And again, contextually, there wasn't this connected African identity that we can kind of point to today. This idea that like the entire continent was one mass just wasn't really an idea that many people had. They were very, you could say, segmented in the ways that they viewed themselves. And so it wasn't this, so the idea that like, oh well, I need to go over here and work with this person, I need to work with this person, wasn't really, didn't really exist during that time. And of course, as we kind of talk, as he points out in the rest of the book as well, it's, or in the rest of this section as well, is the fact that they would turn people against each other. So I imagine you have like your little clan here, and you're you know, you're maybe fishing, you're maybe doing some farming and stuff like that. You have a family, and like you're chill, right? You're able to consume, you're able to produce, etc. And you're living fine. Some people come to you, and you maybe know about like neighboring clans and stuff, but it's not necessarily like the biggest deal to you. You don't really, like, it's not the major thing. Then someone comes to you and says, "Hey, we'll give you all of this fancy shit if you work with us to do this." And then they also like maybe sow various forms of divisions into these communities and stuff like that, which again, these communities weren't like interconnected in quote unquote meaningful ways. So it was easy to just like create divisions and just make them fight against each other so that you could kind of get them to give you what you wanted. As it said earlier in the reading, it was all dependent upon just not being given the full context of what was going on in any situation, right? All right, I think I've kind of read through all the parts that I was interested in reading. So if anyone has anything else to say, if they want to stack, I'm all ears. I see that Sensi and Sadu are typing, so I'm gonna kind of give it a little bit of time. All right. Sensi says, creating infighting sounds similar to tactics of politics today too. 100%, 100%. Ensuring that we don't, how do I say it? Okay. Disagreements are fine. what we need to ensure that we do is that when we have our disagreements, we don't have them in public. We maintain our disagreements in private, behind closed doors amongst each other within our group, so that we don't allow for potential enemies to use those divisions among us to separate us even further, right? So if we have a problem, if something happens, we need to ensure that we focus on allowing for us to work together, um and deal with these problems in a private context, because if we do it publicly, these divisions will be used against us, and we can't afford that to happen. We can recognize that balkanization, separation, sectarianism, all of these things are direct tools of empire used to ensure that our potential is not truly met, and we need to ensure that we do whatever we can to prevent all of these things from occurring. So yeah, 100% is definitely similar to the tactics of politics today. Tadu says they can read. I okay, yeah. Um, yeah, I'll tell you when we're kind of done. All right, then Saber says definitely hard to do that when there's so many people chasing clout online for various reasons, namely for engagements to boost their platforms, which makes them more money. Exactly. Um, and the internet is obviously, Twitter is public, Instagram, uh well, not Discord, but these are public platforms that can, the information can easily be scraped. They do, not even just easily, but they do have people that they pay to scroll through all of these threads and look at things and see what's happening. They even pay people to, they have quote unquote troll farms. Like I know I think we saw at some point the amount that they pay for like Israeli troll farms, for people to go online and like make tweet threads and retweet and quote tweet things and respond to things online. So a lot of like the Zionist narratives that you might see online might literally be someone sitting in a Zionist troll farm, like just unironically getting paid to do this. Uh, so try to be mindful of it. Stay woke. um, but yeah, so a lot of people, like Saber said, online are trying to just get likes, clicks, etc. But the question really is that like a principled thing to do as people that want to create a better material world, right? It's a very self-centered, very selfish view. If all you really care about is how many likes you get, how many followers you have, etc. What we're really looking for is real material change within our society. And so focusing on those numbers on Twitter is really not going to get us forward as a people. That's not a strategy that's going to work for us. Okay. All right. um Sadu, you said you were fine with reading.
Yeah. Where were we?
Page 125 on the
I've got
PDF
different
or
books. So, but what does it
okay.
start with? The paragraph?
It says
Of
of
course.
course
Oh, yeah.
it is
Okay.
only, yeah.
Okay. Of course, it is only as a last resort that the capitalist metropoles need to use armed force to ensure the pursuit of favorable policies in dependent areas. Normally, economic weapons are sufficient. In the 1720s, Dahomey opposed European slave traders and was deprived of European imports, some of which had become necessary by that time. Agaja Trudeau, Dahomey's greatest king, approached the European demand for slaves and the pursuit of slaving in and around Dahomey was in conflict with Dahomey's development. Between 1724 and 1726, he looted and burned European forts and slave camps, and reduced the trade from the slave coast to a mere trickle. By blocking the paths leading to the sources of supply in the interior, European slave dealers were very bitter, and they tried to sponsor some African collaborators against Agaja Trudeau. They failed to unseat him or to crush the Dahomean state, but in turn, Agaja failed to persuade them to develop new lines of economic activity, such as local plantation agriculture, and being anxious to acquire firearms and cowries through the Europeans, he had to agree to the resumption of slave trading in 1730. Um, After 1730, the Dahomey enslaving was placed under royal control and was much more restricted than previously. Yet the failure of this determined effort demonstrated that a single African state at that time could not emancipate itself from European control. The small size of African states and the numerous political divisions made it so much easier for Europe to make the decisions as to Africa's role in world production and trade. Many guilty consciences have been created by the slave trade. Europeans know that they carried on the slave trade, and Africans are aware that the trade would have been impossible if certain Africans did not cooperate with the slave ships. To ease their guilty consciences, Europeans tried to throw the major responsibility for the slave trade onto the Africans. One European author of a book on the slave trade, appropriately entitled "Sins of Our Fathers," explained how many other wild people. Oh yeah, this book is it's a lot of typos.
Yeah,
Let me
yeah,
let
it's
me look
white
on the
people.
screen. Oh,
Because mine that's a T there. Many other white people.
oh yeah. Explained how many other white people urged him to state that the trade was the responsibility of African chiefs, and that Europeans merely turned up to buy the captives, as though without European demand there would have been captives sitting on the beach by the millions. Issues such as those are not the principal concern of this study, but they can be correctly approached only after understanding that Europe became the center of a worldwide system and that it was European capitalism which set slavery and the Atlantic trade in motion. The trade in human beings from Africa was a response to external factors. At first, the labor was needed in Portugal, Spain, and in Atlantic islands such as Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and the Canaries. Then came the period when the Greater Antilles and the Spanish-American mainland needed replacements for the Indians who were victims of genocide. And then the demands of Caribbean and mainland plantation societies had to be met. The records show direct connections between levels of exports from Africa and European demand for slave labor in some part of the African plantation economy. When the Dutch took Pernambuco in Brazil in 1634, the director of the Dutch West Indian Company immediately informed their agents on the Gold Coast that they were to take the necessary steps to pursue the trade in slaves on the adjacent coast east of the Volta, thus creating for that area the infamous name of the Slave Coast. When the British West Indian Islands took to growing sugarcane, Gambia was one of the first places to respond. Examples of this kind of external control can be cited right up to the end of the tirade, and this embraces Eastern Africa also, since European markets in the Indian Ocean islands became important in the 18th and 19th centuries, and since demand in places like Brazil caused Mozambicans to be shipped around the Cape of Good Hope. Should I stop here?
We can have a bit of a discussion. We can have a bit of discussion. All right. Does anyone have anything they want to say? They can type stack in chat. But yeah, we can have a discussion. Thank you so much for reading, and then you can come back in and continue reading again if you want.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I thought the bit where he said I can't find the exact quote, but where he says people like try to put the blames on the Africans themselves, as if like without the Europeans showing up, they would just be captives sitting on the beach by the millions. And like, yeah, I've heard that like argument a lot, like by fucking racists, I guess. It's the Africans themselves that sold each other to us. It's not our fault, stuff like that. It's not. It's like, okay, like maybe they took captives in war and stuff, but it was never like an industry like that. That demand created that supply. It was never like that before. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I thought that was really good.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. You know, I think the main thing that Walter Rodney was trying to point out was that was that, you know, the what was it? Wait, I have it highlighted, but I think I highlighted too much. Wait, hold on. But the point was that yeah, the trade in human beings from Africa was a response to external factors, right? It's not like you know what I mean. I mean, like you pointed out in the in what you were saying, and like it says just before that, it's not like these Africans would have just been sitting there, right? It's not like all of these people would have been there without any other push. It necessarily that need for free labor for the development of European capitalism was why enslavement needed or kind of ended up occurring in the first place, right? This is precisely the conditions were not things that were like, oh well, we feel like we have too many Africans. We need to ensure that we sell them off to others. That's not what happened at all, right? It was necessarily the Europeans that felt that they needed the human quote unquote human resource to develop in the way that they needed to, and they tried to do whatever they could to get that kind of development. This okay, yeah. So thank you so much for that input. Thank you both Saber and Sadie for pointing those things out, for kind of inciting those kinds of conversation. I think my last quote is wait, why did why did I highlight this? Okay, I'm gonna read it and maybe I'll remember why I highlighted it. Okay, wait, I need to read a bit before this. Okay. The records show direct connections between levels of exports from Africa and European demand for slave labor in some part of the American plantation economy. When the Dutch took Pernambuco in Brazil in 1634, the director of the Dutch West Indian Company immediately informed the agents on the Gold Coast that they were to take necessary steps to pursue the trade in slaves on the adjacent coast of the Volta, thus creating for that area the infamous name of the Slave Coast. When the British West Indians took to growing sugarcane, the Gambia was one of the first places to respond. Examples of this kind of external control can be in instance right up to the end of the trade, and this embraces Eastern Africa also, since European markets in the Indian Ocean islands became important in the 18th and 19th centuries, and since demand in places like Brazil caused Mozambicans to be shipped around the Cape of Good Hope. So that's another very interesting thing where which is like kind of pointed out throughout the whole or throughout this entire reading was the case that the entirety of this the development of enslavement the this system was based upon European demand. The entire thing from top to bottom was based upon European demand and European will being put upon literally the rest of the world. Um okay, all right. Sorry, I just okay, so yeah, so actually yeah, since we're actually at the end of this section, we'll just kind of wrap it up. All right?